Welcome again, everyone who's joined us to our webinar today. We are going to be talking about when, why, and how to talk to your provider about using cannabis-based products for anti-seizure treatment. So I want to share a few reminders before we get started. And one of them is that the Epilepsy Foundation does not provide individual medical advice. We don't provide medical advice, but we do want to provide people with the information and the tools that they need to talk to their provider and make the best possible decisions for themselves with their doctor in the treatment, especially when they're considering a cannabis-based product to add to their anti-seizure treatment regimen. So our position for this is that we support safe, legal access to medical cannabis and CBD if a person with epilepsy and their healthcare team feel that the potential health benefits of medical cannabis or CBD for uncontrolled epilepsy outweigh the risks of those treatments. And medical cannabis or CBD must always be used under the close supervision of a treating physician. And you should not stop taking any of your anti-seizure medicines without the knowledge or support of your treating physicians. We definitely want to support breaking down barriers to research on cannabis and ways that we can understand its potential therapeutic benefits and potential harms so that we can give people the best possible information so that they and their doctors can make their best decisions. So I'm Brandy Fearman. I'm the Chief Outcomes Officer here at the Epilepsy Foundation, and I'll be your moderator this afternoon. We are grateful that the webinar today is sponsored by Jazz Pharmaceuticals. And today we're going to focus on learning how to talk to your provider about CBD and other medical cannabis-based products and understand the key differences between things that are FDA-regulated and non-FDA-regulated CBD products and other medical cannabis products, and stay updated on the latest changes in federal laws and in state laws, because as you know, this is an area where federal and state law both apply. Just some last housekeeping reminders. We invite questions. We love questions. And if you have a question for the speaker, please put those into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You should see a little square with a question mark in it, and it says Q&A. That's where you type in your questions for the panelists. Again, we're unable to give specific medical advice, so please try to keep your questions as general as possible. And we're always going to suggest that you speak with your healthcare team to address any specific concerns. And finally, our webinar is being recorded today so that we can upload it to our social media channels and our YouTube channel. So look for it there if you'd like to follow up and listen again to any parts of it. Okay, now I have the absolute pleasure of introducing our amazing speakers and panelists today. We've got a diverse group of perspectives for you, and I am so pleased that they were willing to join us and have this conversation today. So I'll introduce each of them, and then we'll start with the discussion. And I'd like to start with Dr. Archana Pasupuleti. She is a pediatric neurologist and an epileptologist in Washington, D.C. She's dedicated her career to advocating and taking care of children with refractory epilepsy. That's treatment-resistant epilepsy. She completed her undergraduate degree at Stanford and then went on to get her MD, from George Washington University School of Medicine in Washington, D.C. Archana then went on to complete a pediatrics residency and a pediatric neurology residency at Children's National Hospital in Washington, and then did a fellowship in clinical epilepsy at the UCSF Benioff Children's Hospital in San Francisco. So it takes a lot of training to get to the point of expertise that Archana, Dr. Pasupuleti, brings to us today. She has served on the Epilepsy Foundation's Professional Advisory Board. She's chair of the PAB Advocacy Committee, and she serves on the Epilepsy Foundation's Policy Committee. She has deep roots in the advocacy space, and she has prior career experiences in nonprofits, government, and philanthropic sectors, working in some other disease areas as well, as including HIV/AIDS, childhood obesity, and gender and racial differences in healthcare. She has a multidisciplinary approach to medicine, and she looks at clinical medicine through the social factors that might affect the delivery of care. And we're so grateful that Dr. Pozzopoletti is joining us today. I am delighted also to introduce you to Dr. Barry Goodall, who received his Bachelor of Science degree from the University of Utah and his Doctor of Pharmacy degree from the University of Washington in Seattle. He also completed a residency and a research fellowship in clinical pharmacokinetics at the University of Washington. He is a professor of pharmacy at University of Wisconsin-Madison School of Pharmacy, and he has a clinical practice taking care of veterans at the William S. Middleton Veterans Affairs Hospital Epilepsy Clinic. Dr. Goodall's research interests are in the pharmacotherapy of epilepsy, and particularly in anti-seizure medicines and drug interactions in adults with epilepsy. He is an active member of the American Epilepsy Society, where he currently serves on their board of directors. And he's also the immediate past chair of the Epilepsy Foundation of Wisconsin's Professional Advisory Board. So Dr. Goodall, thank you for your service to the foundation as well, and welcome to the webinar. And finally, I'm really pleased to introduce to you Laura Widener, who is the Epilepsy Foundation's Chief Advocacy and Government Relations Officer. Laura leads and oversees the foundation's strategy on federal and state level policy, legal advocacy, and grassroots engagement. So you may have gotten some emails from Laura suggesting that you write to your congressperson about one issue or another. The advocacy initiatives at the foundation seek to do four things: to improve access to care, to end epilepsy-related discrimination, to foster research and innovation, and to promote public health and education. Laura has been with the foundation since September of 2018, after she spent 9 years focusing on federal access to care and disability rights for the National MS Society. So she brings expertise from another neurological disorder to our group. She's also in a number of leadership positions, especially for partnerships to improve patient care, the American Brain Coalition, the Epilepsy's Action Network, and the Epilepsy Leadership Council, and the Partnership to Protect Coverage. Laura has a Bachelor of Arts degree from Ohio University and a law degree from the Ohio State University, Moritz College of Law. She's also a member of the bar in Maryland and the District of Columbia. So Laura, thank you so much for joining us and bringing that legal expertise. So as you can tell, we have a terrific panel today. I'm thrilled that you're all here joining us. I'd like to kick off the questions, starting with, just some basics, putting us all on the same page together. Let's learn a little bit more about CBD, or cannabidiol, which is the proper name for CBD, and also medical cannabis as they relate to epilepsy and seizures. Why do we even think that this is a potential treatment option for people with epilepsy? And Archana, I'll throw that question to you first.
Thank you, Brandy, and thank you to the Epilepsy Foundation for having me on this webinar today. And you have asked such a great question. So we have different regulatory systems in our body and different receptors and neurons in our brain. One of the systems that we have is the endocannabinoid system. And that cannabinoid system really helps regulate, either upregulate or sort of downregulate many functions in our brain, whether it's sleep, it's appetite, inflammation. We've seen this system also take effect with either slowing down the excitatory process that happens in your brain when you have seizures, or in some cases, there can be transmitters that prolong the seizure. And so when this research started and the use of cannabinoids or medical cannabis, we really looked at how it affects the system and what effect it would have on seizures. There are clinical trials, randomized control trials in the last 5 to 10 years that have particularly studied CBD oil or CBD cannabinoid looking at the reduction in seizures. And keep in mind, running a randomized control trial is very difficult. It's very rigorous. And these trials have shown that for specific types of epilepsy and specific seizure types, there can be up to a 50% reduction in the types of seizures. The range is anywhere from 30% up to 70%. And in terms of medical cannabis, and we'll talk about this throughout the webinar, we have not had those similar randomized control trials. And this can, as we're doing research in this space, we are moving towards seeing if there is more supporting evidence. Anecdotally, we've seen that medical cannabis can impact seizure control, but again, per patient with specific epilepsies and specific seizure types.
Great. Thank you, Archana. And can you just ask a follow-up? Can you say a little bit more about the ages of the people who were in that clinical trial and the types of epilepsy or seizures that they had?
Right. So in these clinical trials, we were looking at a wide age range, but mostly looking at children and adolescents with specific conditions such as Lennox-Gastaut syndrome or Dravet syndrome. And we were looking at CBD in conjunction as an additive to the other epilepsy medications they were currently taking. And we were focusing on specific seizure types. So the focal seizures, or we were looking at tonic-clonic seizures where you're stiff but also shaking. And this is where the research focused on. It was looking at specific genetic epilepsy, and it was looking at a specific type of syndrome. Now,
Okay, so
sorry.
I was just going to say, so it sounds from what you're saying that the evidence is very good in that group of age ranges and for those syndromes in particular. That's where we have the strongest evidence. Is that right?
Exactly. And not a sole treatment, but in conjunction with the treatment that they were currently on.
Great, thank you. So Dr. Goodall, I want to turn to you for a second and ask, can you help us understand the difference between CBD and medical cannabis?
Sure.
Help us understand why those are two different things.
Yeah, I'm really glad you're asking that because I think that's a point of confusion. So like what Archana was just talking about with the clinical trials was with a purified form of just cannabidiol, right? And at doses that were far higher. Again, we've got historical evidence of cannabis, being useful in reports in patients with epilepsy, but it seemed to be that it was the CBD component of the cannabidiol versus the THC or maybe whatever else was in there. So, so that's an important distinction, and we'll touch on those kind of things as well. When people look at, for those that are, the chemists in the audience, they'll look at a picture of CBD and they'll look at a picture of the structure of THC, delta 9 THC, and they go, God, those look awfully the same. That's in 2 dimensions, right? If you look in 3 dimensions, they actually are very different, and they interact with different receptors, different places in the brain. And that's why we see very differing effects. And I think that also explains why we have very good evidence, from the randomized control trials about cannabidiol in these different seizure types, but we don't really have that with THC. And it's because it's very difficult to do those kind of studies because they really are, you're talking about almost two different drugs. And so just for our conversation today, I like to refer to when we talk about medical cannabis as a term, we think of that sounds like one drug. It's actually kind of a basket full of drug. We know in the marijuana plant, there's at least been 100 plus cannabinoids that have been identified. We don't even know what most of them do. So it's talking about a lot of different drugs. So I think that's an important distinction you need to make. I don't know if that answered the question or not.
Great. No, it definitely did. Yeah, thank you. And I also wanted to ask Laura, we've talked about the legal status of CBD and the legal status of medical marijuana. Can you say something about, how that varies across states and at the federal level too?
Yes, I have a lot to say because it's pretty complicated, but stay with me, guys. So I want to start by saying there is, of course, one FDA-approved CBD product for seizures associated with 3 rare forms of epilepsy, which has gone through extensive controlled clinical trials to be approved. So that is a separate situation because it's FDA-approved. And therefore not within the bounds of the cannabis CBD laws and restrictions that I'm about to talk about. So I just wanted to say that up front. But yes, at this point, 49 states and the District of Columbia have legalized either the recreational or medical use of cannabis, or allow access to CBD to some degree. Some states, I will say, so a lot of laws like legalizing, et cetera, on some level. I will say that more recently, some states have started to set clear guidelines, and in some instances, even start restricting access a little bit again through dosage limits, packaging, and age restrictions. So that's at the state level. At the federal level, however, cannabis is currently still a Schedule I controlled substance. Schedule I means by government standards that the government believes it has a high potential for abuse and no accepted medical use. So therefore, at the federal level, it is illegal to use, buy, sell, or possess. I will also just make a note on that federal Schedule I status, that does create a barrier to conducting medical research, which, as Archana and Dr. Goodall were saying, is quite a challenge because we definitely want to learn more about the potential benefits and harms of cannabis as a treatment option for epilepsy and seizures. Few more things. In 2018, at the federal level, hemp-derived products with no more than 0.3 concentration of delta-9 THC were removed from the DEA's schedule of controlled substances. So hemp-derived CBD with less than 0.3 THC is legal at the federal level. Archana referenced that the research aspect. So another recent federal law that was enacted just at the end of 2022, Congress did pass a law that creates a new process for researchers to register to manufacture, distribute, dispense, and possess cannabis for research purposes. The foundation was supportive of enacting that law so that we can hopefully understand more about why it could work and what the potential harms are. The last thing I'll note on all of the legality stuff is that, and this has been in the news a lot this year, so you might have seen it, but in April of this year, the DEA proposed to move cannabis from Schedule I to Schedule III under the Controlled Substances Act. That is something that the foundation is also supportive of. We submitted comments along with a lot of other epilepsy organizations for a few reasons, one of which is to hopefully, again, be able to conduct more research. Moving the schedule is seen as a way to potentially do that. But I just want to kind of end, so very, very complex. I just want to kind of end like coming back to the Epilepsy Foundation's position that we advocate for everyone to have safe and legal access, so long as the person with epilepsy working with their healthcare provider feels that the potential benefits outweigh the risks. And that we do not want people to lose access to any treatment that is working for them. So again, federal and state level, we try to do everything we can to ensure that access, because we know the potential consequences of someone losing access to a treatment that is working for them for whatever reason is too severe and too dangerous.
Right. Thanks, Laura. Real quick follow-up. If someone is interested in knowing what their particular state law looks like, are there resources that they can go to?
We have on epilepsy.com, we do have a state-by-state map that will tell you if it's legalized for recreational and or medical in your state. And then honestly, if you just also Google, your state name and cannabis laws, a lot of resources will come up, and we can always help you navigate which ones are, reliable sources.
Great, thank you. So I want to bounce back to Dr. Pozzopoletti for a second. And Laura mentioned that there's an FDA-approved version of CBD, but then she also mentioned medical cannabis and recreational cannabis. So can you tell us a little bit about the difference between something that has been FDA-approved and some of these other products that you might be able to buy at a dispensary or local source, but have not been FDA approved? What's the difference there?
So that's actually a great question and an important distinction. So when we say something is FDA approved, so currently we only have Epidiolex, that's the FDA approved CBD. It's as Barry had mentioned, it is pure cannabidiol. It is non-psychoactive, so it doesn't have any THC component. And because it's FDA approved, I'm actually allowed to write a prescription, and you can go have the medication either mailed to you. Typically, it's mailed to you and it's regulated. One of the advantages of that is that you will be getting the same concentration of the CBD in every bottle that you have. It's consistent and it has the manufacturing standards and it's regulated. When we talk about the medical cannabis that you are able to pick up at the dispensary, there currently are no standards that test how much how much level of CBD there is compared to the other active components, such as Delta 9, or as Barry had mentioned, that you can have up to 100 different components. It can vary from batch to batch, strain to strain. Why that can sometimes become a challenge is in the clinical trials that were done, one of the results that we've seen is that the CBD can interact with medication, and sometimes it can increase the drug levels of other anti-seizure medications you're taking. But if you don't know the dose you're getting consistently, that can fluctuate the levels of medication in your body. So it's important. And so really the difference is the consistency. It's the difference that one is manufactured and regulated, and that I have the ability to prescribe it when it's FDA approved.
Thank you. And Barry, I'm going to come back to you on that question of interacting with other medications that you might be taking. Can you tell us a little more about what we know about how CBD might interact with other medications that people might be on?
Sure. So the answer to that is there's some things we know a lot about it, but we don't know a lot about it. Okay? And I'll explain what I mean by that. That we do know that CBD, and to somewhat of a lesser extent THC, can interfere and inhibit the action of some drug metabolizing enzymes, both in our liver and probably our gut too, that's involved in metabolizing or getting rid of other medicines. Now, during the randomized controlled trials that Archana was talking about, for patients with these very specific devastating epilepsy syndromes, we knew what some of the other medicines were. We knew what the enzymes. There's been a lot of work. That's why I said we do know a lot about what enzyme CBD can interfere with. But there's a lot of other drugs that patients are out there taking that our patients in the clinical trials were not. So that's created kind of a problem for patients, consumers, clinicians, is that we can predict basic mechanisms, but a lot of drugs that people are taking, they may be CBD may be interfering with, and we don't have the studies and we don't have the data. And the thing that I'm concerned about outside of, say, of Archana's, where she can prescribe Epidiolex and she knows what other medicines that you're taking, say like blood thinners, or some of our, let's call them, the chronologically gifted, our older patients. I'm one of those. But if you're taking like, blood thinner medicines like warfarin or some of these other drugs, we do know that CBD can interfere with those and maybe to potentially dangerous levels. The concern that I have is if it's not you know, as we've been talking about, talk to your healthcare provider. If people are now trying to use cannabis on their own and not talking to their doctor and pharmacist about it, they could be putting themselves in some danger depending on the other medicines. So that's what I mean. We know a lot, but there's a lot of things we don't know the full scope of what might be the problem out there.
Right. And that's one of the reasons we advocate so heavily for more research, because the more we know, the better we are at using any of these effective therapies safely in people. Thank you.
And the one point I wanted to just add to that, I encourage a discussion with your physician to ask the questions you have, because the best way to treat CBD and medical cannabis is to think of it as a therapy. Even if it's plant derived, I still treat this as a medical therapy. And it is very important, as Barry had said, to make sure that you're on the same page with your physician about what could be potential interactions, what we need to look out for in terms of side effects, not just monitoring seizure control, but could there be any downstream effects where I may have to adjust your other medications as the CBD is showing improvement, or if the medical cannabis is helping with potentially other aspects of either your child or the adult epilepsy patient.
Yeah, I think what we're saying here, I think we're saying this all the same thing. Communicate. Let your healthcare professional know, what you're taking. And I would say that goes for actually any over-the-counter medicine. Whatever you're taking, let people know, because there could be unintended consequences, and we want to keep people safe.
So this is a great segue into our, what kinds of questions should you be asking your provider? And I think probably the very first one is, am I or is my child a good candidate for trying, either the FDA-regulated product, another medical cannabis product, and why or why not? Why would we be or not be a good candidate to think about trying this? The other question I think people need to have top of mind is, what kind of side effects might there be about adding something like this to my anti-seizure treatments? And Archana, would you like to talk about some of the side effects that you've seen in your patients?
And so typically, the most common side effects we've seen usually impact our GI system. So oftentimes you can see diarrhea or upset stomach or nausea. We've also seen sometimes appetite changes. So for some, it's actually appetite suppression, or there can be a little bit of weight loss. We've seen just increased somnolence, sort of tiredness, and just feeling that fatigue, or a little bit more sleepy than they may have been in the past. And again, that's why it's so important for us to have this discussion with our families, because we need to determine, is it because of the drug-drug interaction? It's sort of, and it's raising levels of your other medication, so maybe I can wean some of your other medication, or is it that we need to lower the dose of the CBD or the medical cannabis that you've been started on?
Thank you. And we've gotten a question in the chat. Are there studies on epilepsy in adults using CBD? Anybody want to comment on that?
Sure, I can jump in. So those same studies that we talked about for Lennox-Gastaut and tuberous sclerosis did actually have some middle-aged, adults in there. There were, I think, the Lennox-Gastaut may have been up to like 50-year-olds. So yes, while the majority were children or adolescents, we do have some of that data, some of that evidence in adults.
Okay, great. And we got a follow-up question. We mentioned that there are 3 syndromes for which the FDA-approved product is currently indicated, and those were Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, Dravet syndrome, and tuberous sclerosis complex, the seizures associated with those syndromes. So at the moment, that's what the FDA-approved product is indicated for. And I know that, for some folks who have been hoping to access that, insurance coverage has been a bit of a challenge, because if you don't have one of those three syndromes, your insurance company may say, this isn't necessarily an indicated product for you. But at the moment, it's those three rare syndromes that have been written, the label is written for those seizures associated with those syndromes. Another good question to ask is, what might my risk of dependence be if I start using a product like this? Do I need to worry about abuse potential or becoming dependent?
You asking either one of us, or who should?
Yeah, Barry, why don't you take that one
Okay.
first?
So a couple things to that. First, we know that that was one of the concerns when Epidiolex was first FDA approved. It's subsequently, studies have shown that no, there is no abuse potential. That's why it was called descheduled, if you will. It's not scheduled drug. So there's no abuse potential. Now, with regular old cannabis, marijuana that's used, there is no, we've over the last few years begun to recognize there's a cannabis use disorder. There are some people who develop dependency, and there is a fairly real concern that, especially in young people in that developing brain that are using, I'm not talking pure CBD now, I'm talking about with marijuana, with THC, that there could be a dependence syndrome, and that can be somewhat difficult sometimes to manage and to treat. And so there is that concern. We didn't really recognize that necessarily a number of years ago.
Yeah, we've gotten a great question in the chat about are there other trials coming that will look at CBD and Epidiolex in particular for other forms of epilepsy. And I just took a very quick look on clinicaltrials.gov. That's a website that the government maintains and provides, and it's every registered clinical trial that's happening or is planned, where you can go on and look to see if there are clinical trials in your disease area, near you. They will list the sites where the trial is being performed. And that's a really good place to keep an eye out for any new studies coming down the pike on CBD in other forms of epilepsy. So clinicaltrials.gov is where I would recommend people watch out for those kinds of trials coming. Okay, let's talk a little bit about concerns that might be specific to kids, right? So, Archana, what do you think is the safety profile, the long-term safety considerations for using CBD in children or adolescents?
So, as we mentioned, the adverse events or the side effects we talked about, we have shown that the majority of them will stop once you either stop the medication or can be managed if the medication is working for you. There has been no safety or concern for safety with this medication. The clinical trials have shown that it is safe to use as an adjunct. And when I mean that, I mean there haven't been studies that have shown you can use it solely as treatment for epilepsy. So when you think of safety and seizures, you also want to keep in mind when you're treating the seizures, you're thinking about its safety in that context. The clinical trials did show that while you might have these side effects, they really weren't to the level where this medication is going to be recalled or there were serious safety indicators.
Okay, great. So you mentioned that the trial itself was done with CBD as an add-on to the other therapies that the people were taking. And I know, you sometimes hear people say, oh, I want to get rid of these other medicines and only use this, quote unquote, natural kind of product. What do you say to parents, for example, who say, I'd like to take my kid off of these other prescription medicines and just use, CBD?
Um, so as we had mentioned, the real key is to think about it in the sort of broad spectrum of therapies for
Mhm.
epilepsy treatment. Just because it is plant-based doesn't mean, as Barry has been describing, that it doesn't have interactions in the body, interactions with your receptors in your brain, or interaction with other medication. And so I say, my goal is always to have your child or your family member on the least amount of medications that are the most effective at achieving our goal, whether our goal is seizure freedom or a reduction in the number of seizures you're having, the duration of seizures, or other side effects that would improve that would target other side effects to improve your quality of life. I would say that right now there is no evidence that it could be used all by itself to control seizures. But if you, with your doctor, sort of feel that it might be worth sort of reducing the other medications you're on, or sort of working towards that goal, that is something that is dependent for each specific patient.
Okay, great. But I think that one of the keys is you don't want to just stop taking any anti-seizure medicine quickly, right? And especially not without talking with your doctor about how that should look, because I think that can present some real harm potentially.
And the risk we face with that is once you suddenly stop the other medications, you have the risk of ending up in the emergency room for seizures that are not controlled, or ending up in the hospital if you suddenly stop, because you may actually get sort of what we call withdrawal seizures from suddenly stopping your medication. And as we had talked about, the clinical trials did show that the levels of the anti-seizure medications are impacted by CBD. And so if you suddenly stop some of the other meds you're taking, your CBD oil or your CBD itself or your medical cannabis itself might not be enough to protect you from having further seizures, because now you've suddenly stopped the therapies you've been on.
Great advice. And that's one of the biggest reasons we say always talk to your doctor about everything you're taking, and the strategies that are going to work best for you when you're thinking about this. Laura, along the same lines of children using CBD, what are the positions that kids are experiencing at school? So, are many kids being allowed to take this at school? Are they not allowed to take it at school? Where's the legal rights on that?
Yeah, great question. And one we get asked a good amount, as I'm sure Barry and Archana do. So again, Epidiolex, which is the FDA-approved medication for seizures associated with 3 rare forms of epilepsy. That is, again, FDA approved. It is a medication, as Archana said, it is prescribed by your doctor. So just like any other FDA approved medication, that is allowed in schools. When it comes to other, types of medical cannabis that are, not FDA approved, obviously, a handful of states have passed laws that allow students to consume medical cannabis on school property under certain conditions. Usually they have to obviously have a valid medical recommendation, non-smokable. Parents or legal guardian might have to administer it. Other states have allowed consumption of medical cannabis on school grounds, but they leave the specific rules governing the use up to individual school districts. So in that case, even if the state allows it, some of the school districts in the state might not. Schools may have their own policies. Some may allow it with proper documentation, while other school districts might not even allow it on school grounds. But most states have remained silent and have no laws on the books about consumption on school property, largely because cannabis is still a Schedule I controlled substance, as I mentioned earlier, under federal law. So I think the main takeaway here, if you have a child who is either looking at using this type of treatment or is currently, You want to check your state's laws. You also want to check your school district's laws, and even talk to your specific school just to get exactly how they operate.
Great, thanks, Laura. And if someone runs into difficulties in navigating, that process, is there a resource that they can contact at the foundation to get some help and advice?
Yes, the foundation has the Gene Carpenter Legal Defense Program, so we can put that information in the chat. We can help navigate, whatever your state and school district's laws are. And as always, as Barry and Archana have said many times, probably also talk to your doctor, being local. They probably have a good sense of what the local laws and rules are.
Thank you. Okay, we've gotten some great questions in the chat. One is about the age ranges that were in the studies focused on children. So the clinical trials, what were the ages of the children? And here particularly, we're looking for I think the lower age limit. And then is there any information on the outcomes of children who are younger compared to older kids in those clinical trials? That's a pretty specific question, but you might be able to help us.
So initial trials for FDA approval were 2 and older. In the most recent years, the FDA has actually expanded the use to 1 and above. And so right around sort of 12 months is when most insurance companies will approve Epidiolex for the conditions that we listed, the 3 conditions, and the seizures that are related to those conditions. And in terms of, did we see a better response when they were younger versus when they were older? As with any clinical trial, it can be a little complicated to kind of parse out the data. And so there was no clear evidence that it was better for ages 2 and 3 versus 12 to 13. Where you really saw the difference was actually the seizure types. And so certain seizure types had a little, I would say a little more potent of a response in terms of seizure reduction as it was measured in the clinical trial. And so when we were really looking at where the impact was, it was with the focal motor seizures and looking at the seizures called atonic seizures, the ones where you either suddenly fall or have a head drop. They're very brief. You may or may not lose awareness with them. And then we saw a little bit less of a response with sort of those larger tonic-clonic seizures. It was really for those with the head drops and really the focal motor.
You. And, for those of you who are listening and might not know what type of seizures you have, I'd really encourage you to spend a little time on epilepsy.com in our Understand Epilepsy section, because you can go through all of the different types of seizures there are. And it's really important that you know your seizure types. Many of the treatment decisions are informed by what kind of seizures you have. So making sure that you and your doctor both understand, what types of seizures are you dealing with is really important. And that's something that you can educate yourself about so that you can have better conversations with your healthcare provider. Barry, I want to ask one more question to you in terms of, if you have medical disorders in addition to your epilepsy, or, maybe comorbidities with your epilepsy, like anxiety or depression, is there any unique concerns about using a cannabis-based product when you have another medical condition too?
Sure. Can I just, before I get to that, can I just tag on to what Archana said? Because I saw
Sure, please
in
do.
the chat about 25-plus-year-olds. So I think I said this earlier, that when we went back and looked at the clinical trials, there was not as many of, older adults or middle-aged adults, but there were a fair number. And similarly, there was no, because I focus really on adults, there was no significant difference, or not, I would say substantive differences between the way the adults responded versus the rest of the group. So that gives me a certain measure of confidence, in the drug, that there's not something unique that it works across that span of ages. But of course, we still need more work. Okay, now to your question, Brandy, about the condition. As Archana was talking about, we've now got a pretty good set of data with Epidiolex, with pure CBD, and there doesn't seem to be, a problem, because outside maybe if it's causing a drug interaction that's causing a side effect. But I'm not as concerned about some of the psychiatric issues. But again, with cannabis, there is a concern that I have about THC. And the big driving force is, if you look over the years since the 1970s, when people started looking at it, the concentration of THC in cannabis has been cultivated such that it's, it used to be a couple percent, and now maybe it's 18, 20+%. So the THC in cannabis you're getting now is a lot different than, say, it was, well, I hate to say how many years ago that was, but, a long time ago. And so I do worry about, if you have an anxiety disorder, or, people self-medicate and in depression, some of these things that may be dangerous or counterproductive simply because of the concentration of that THC. And you don't know from batch to batch what you're getting necessarily. I mean, you might at a dispensary, but still, I worry about that. Those are the concerns. And as I think I alluded to, especially people who have a history of having used marijuana before and maybe having something to the doctor that sounds like a psychotic episode, they may be at real risk for the continued use of cannabis. Now, I'm not talking about Epidiolex. I'm talking about things that have THC, of leading to other psychiatric disorders. So again, it's communication with your doctor. Tell them if you want to use cannabis, have you ever used it before and anything ever, bad happen or unusual happen?
Okay, thank you. Laura, one last question on the legal perspective. So, say someone is either using the pure form, of CBD, Epidiolex, or another sort of purified version of CBD or medical cannabis itself. Are there other kinds of legal issues that they might need to be aware of? What about driving? What about, drug testing at work? Those kinds of questions.
Yeah, our legal defense program especially gets questions about this somewhat regularly. Yeah, I mean, that is just part of your discussion and decision-making process, I would say. And, again, something as you're talking to your doctor about whether to try or if you're currently using one of these treatments. But we do hear of, people encountering challenges if they're using a product with even just concerns that they might have workplace drug testing. Driving, yes, absolutely. We get calls from people who, have driven after they have used, and it has become a problem for them. And the other one I would say we hear about somewhat regularly is traveling across state lines. Even if someone is about to travel, they call us to say, what do I do? Can I take this with me? So I'd say those are the most common ones we hear about. And I don't know if Archana or Barry want to add anything from their perspective on those.
I was actually going to say, Laura, the crossing the state lines, especially when Epidiolex first came out, and we had those also using medical cannabis as well. So because you have a prescription for the Epidiolex, and it's you can see the label, and I'm able to prescribe it in all states, crossing state lines isn't as much of a challenge with Epidiolex as it once was in the past. But because you can have a prescription, it tends to be easier to travel with that medication than the medical cannabis, more from a legal standpoint.
And to add to that, I think it also helped that it was now descheduled, so it's not a controlled substance. It's still a prescription item. But the other thing Brandy, brought up about drug testing, and that's obviously a concern if you're using medical cannabis. and your job, whatever that job is, say you're a federal person, or that you get drug tested, it's going to test positive for THC, and that's going to be difficult depending on the job. With Epidiolex, because it's again that purified CBD, that shouldn't be a concern. What people are looking for is that delta 9 THC.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. We've had a really wide-ranging discussion, but I think it has been helpful in folks who are either considering, adding something like this to their treatment regimen. Again, the kinds of things you want to talk to your doctor about are, am I a good candidate for this? Are my seizure types ones that, CBD or medical cannabis will help with? How might it impact my other medications? How might other conditions that I have influence, the way this will work in my body? Are there long-term consequences I should be aware of? What kinds of side effects should I expect or look out for? Those kinds of things are all ones that you want to talk over with your healthcare team, in addition to any of the legal issues that are specific to your state, or even your particular situation, like your job situation or school situation, as we talked through. So I hope some of these conversations have helped you to understand why we say it's so important to communicate with your healthcare team whenever you're thinking about adding a cannabis-based product of any sort to your regimen. I want to just close us out with a few, thank yous. First of all, to everybody who has joined the discussion today. Thank you for your excellent questions and for sharing your time with us. I want to thank our sponsor, Jazz Pharmaceuticals, for providing, the support for us to be able to pull this webinar together. Thank you, and for all of the support that you give to many programs at the foundation. I also want to let you know that we are committed to staying updated on the latest state and federal laws around cannabidiol and other cannabis products. And so you can always come to epilepsy.com to get the latest on those federal and state laws. A few other resources we want to be sure that you are aware of is that the foundation offers an epilepsy learning portal where you can get on-demand or live instruction training on seizure first aid and a number of other courses that are of interest to people who help people with epilepsy and family members and other caregivers. So I encourage you, if you haven't yet been certified, our seizure recognition and first aid certification training provides information to increase knowledge, skills, and confidence in recognizing different seizure types and safely administering seizure first aid. Participants who successfully complete the certification course will receive a 2-year certification. Next, we want to invite you to join us on the iconic National Mall on March 15th of 2025 for the National Epilepsy Walk. This isn't just a walk, it's an opportunity for people to come together as a community. We want you to be able to connect with others and make a meaningful impact on the lives of those living with epilepsy. So please consider joining us on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. on March 15th. We also offer support groups and a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week helpline. And that helpline, you can call or email and get support from specially trained information and resources referral specialists. So they can help with questions about your current epilepsy treatment, alternative therapies, medication questions. If you want to get connected to a support group, they can help with questions around employment or discrimination in employment or school settings. We have emotional support for those who have lost someone due to epilepsy. And I encourage you, if you have lost someone you love because of epilepsy, please reach out. We want to be here for you in that time. We have local offices of the Epilepsy Foundation all around the country, and the 24-hour, 7-day-a-week helpline, either in English or in Spanish, can help you get connected to many of those resources. If you have any questions after today's webinar, the helpline is the other place to go. So last, I would invite you to please consider a donation to the Epilepsy Foundation here at the end of the year. There is no better gift than giving the gift of belonging. And your generous donation connects families, caregivers, and individuals living with epilepsy with the resources, support, and the community that they need. I want to thank the advocates, Mike Mullen and his son Matt, who is living with epilepsy, and who have pledged to match all gifts up to $25,000 now through December 31st. So please help us realize that incredibly generous gift. And thank you so much for considering including the Epilepsy Foundation in your year-end giving. So finally, I want to thank our speakers again. Thank you to our sponsor, Jazz, and thank you all for watching. And at this point, we'll close out and wish you all happy holidays.
Thank you.
Take care.